Mhm.
Hello and
Hello,
welcome to
and go ahead.
Hello and welcome to Conversations about Language Teaching. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Reed Riggs, he, him.
I am Dr. Diane Neubauer, she, her.
Diane, you're leading this episode, aren't you?
hmm And we're going to talk through an article. We've done this before with a book chapter. This time we have an article that was actually written in the summer or published in the summer of 1990. It's been a while. So this is a sort of a classic article that has been pivotal in language teaching and thinking about language teaching. And it was published in TESOL Quarterly, so a very, very prominent, prestigious kind of a journal in the field of applied linguistics and language teaching and education. So I wanted to look up how many times it's been cited. I want to say it might be in the 5 digits. It's been cited a lot. So it's it's shaping thinking at the research level as well as I think it trickles into practitioner level. But it's written very much about the language classroom, language teacher thinking, and language teacher conversations and how they make decisions and stuff. So I had to read this when I was first in my graduate studies, and it was like it was a revelation to me. To be honest, I was a little snobby as a teacher. Researchers can be snobby, teachers can be snobby, right? My snobbiness at the time was I don't think researchers really care and think deeply about the experience of the student developing language proficiency. And I don't think they really care deeply about how people make decisions in their classroom and conduct class according to principles that they believe in. And I mean, I didn't have that conscious belief. I think it came out when I read that. So, all this to preface, this has been a really impactful article for me to have read and to rethink my own thinking and my own biases a little bit. It's challenging in some points. Some I really resonate with. Some I think I don't know where he's going with that. I don't know why that's important to him. But so let me say what it is and who wrote it. It's called "There Is No Best Method. Why?" And it's by N.S. Prabhu. When he was working at the National University of Singapore. I believe his country of origin is Sri Lanka, and I know for sure that he did teach in Sri Lanka. He taught English there, and in the 80s, developed a task-based language teaching approach that was very input-based. So it was kind of in the era of starting to develop some methods that might align more towards communicative and input-based or comprehension-based kinds of teaching. So he's published other articles about that and the experiments that they did in like trying to see, quasi experiments in classroom teaching, what was producing results for students, what were they doing. So I'm going to read the little introduction from the beginning. I'm actually holding the article right there. And then I will kind of go through it and we'll bounce ideas off. These are things that we've talked about a ton, Reed, but have you read this or have I just kind of promoted this article to you before?
I've searched and skimmed key parts before, so I've never read the article front to
Okay.
back.
Okay. But yeah, we'll have a great conversation about it.
Yeah.
So the introductory paragraph here says, this paper examines the possible substance of a statement, often heard, but rarely explained in the discussion of language teaching, namely, that there is no best method. Three possible explanations of the statement are discussed based on a broad interpretation of the term method. A, that different methods are best for different teaching contexts. B, that all methods are partially true or valid. And C, that the notion of good and bad methods is itself misguided. The first two explanations are shown to be unhelpful. The third is discussed in some detail with an exploration of the concept, the teacher's sense of plausibility. So his term sense of plausibility gets used in other citations later on too. So we'll get to describing what that is and where he's going with that. So one of my first questions, and I wrote a little note there, like, is that sense of plausibility he aims for, is that the same thing as when you hear a teacher say, well, it works for me and my students? I think he's a little bit different from that, but we'll get there and explore it. So So where he starts out is this idea that a lot of times people will make this kind of a claim. They'll talk about, well, I teach this way, or I teach that way, or well, I'm trying to do this or whatever. And then it's kind of a throwing up your hands in the air going, well, there is no best method. And so kind of like he says, very often this is not getting to a substantive principled conclusion about it. It is a refusal to continue to probe the issues involved. And so he says, like it appears to raise the debate itself to a higher level, thus helping to save professional face all around. And it suggests not just that proponents of different methods agree to disagree, but that they give up the pursuit of agreement and disagreement as being unproductive. And he says that's really not quite it. He then goes on to describe if there is no one best method for everywhere, then that suggests that there are best methods within a certain context. And so it's quite interesting, I think, to think about that.
Yeah, and you can refer back to, we had an episode about teaching context. And I think it was very much inspired, or at least connected or relevant to that article specifically. You and I have been talking about the idea of that article, and also just a lot of push within whenever SLA, applied linguistics, whenever research people who look at these kinds of things talk about, well, what can we do in classrooms? They often bring up, well, it's going to depend on your context. Every context is different. So I would refer teachers also to that episode where we dug into like all different kinds of factors that go into a context.
Right. One of the other things I really appreciate that he does early in this article as well, though, is like he's saying like this kind of a claim is not the end of a discussion, but let's let it be a beginning of a new discussion, or a new phase in it, so that we're probing into the thinking about what does it really mean to have a method at all.
Yeah.
And so he defines method inclusively as both a set of activities to be carried out in the classroom, which is, I think, the way most teachers would use it. It's a set of activities to carry out in the classroom. Some would be like, I like to pick and choose from different methods. Others would be like, no, this is the one that this is the thing that works. And it's a recipe you can use anywhere for all time, kind of a feel to it. So, but he's saying that set of activities is one type of use of the term that he uses, but also to the theory, belief, or plausible concept that informs these activities. So sometimes I hear that called maybe more like an approach, a teaching approach might be at that level, where you're not prescribing exact activities or steps or sequences, but you're saying, here's principles. Now do things that do that. And it's more flexible.
So is he saying even at the principles level that he's including that in his definition of methods, and saying that also there is no one set of principles either? Okay.
Well, no, not so much quite there, but that the theory, belief, or plausible concept that informs any activities in a classroom, he's going to use the term method for that. Not plural S, but just method.
Okay.
So, yeah, I get picky about that S or no S thing because of the Michael Long stuff about form or focus on forms.
Sure.
Or focus on form. So I think he's doing that, actually. I think he's kind of making a similar thing where he's so and he does that in a way as he proceeds in the article that I think I could follow. Like he's talking about, on the one hand, teachers are often talking about those sets of activities, but they're maybe unconsciously informed by some sort of a belief set about principles that they're seeking to carry out. The one thing that I think he takes for granted in this article is he doesn't proclaim clearly what is it that's the goal for the outcome of language education. And I think it's included in here. And I think he talks about it as it's an unconscious acquisition of the language so that they can perform in any kind of context unrehearsed, that they can understand language, they can express meaning, they can negotiate meaning, they can interpret the messages by others. So he does embed that in here, but he doesn't explicitly.
Yeah, I wonder if even at a principles level, if he's including that in his definition of method and saying there's not even a best that. So if a teacher is compared to hypothetical teachers, one says students need to be processing the language a lot in order to grow in their proficiency. And that's where I derive all of my concrete practices from. Everything the students are doing, everything I'm doing, step by step, it's all informed by those goals, the sort of process goals. I want them doing this during the classroom and more generally. And then another teacher, a second teacher says, I have a list of words and a list of grammar, and I'm going to do whatever gets the students learning the words in the order that I plan to teach those words, learning the grammar in the order that I plan to teach that grammar. And that if we're saying there's no best method and we're including those kinds of principles in our definition of method,
Yeah.
that even
Well,
that there's not a best, that
mm,
maybe you'd have to go to an extreme, like they will, I don't know, because some teachers won't even say that proficiency is their goal. And
uh-huh.
I wonder if that's going too far within what he's trying to say. Yeah.
I say that's fair
Yeah.
because he embeds that sense of we're developing students' language abilities, and he kind of
Okay.
hints at what that looks like. I think that is his goal, and I think he's suggesting that that is the language teacher goal,
Okay.
without directly stating it. So
Okay.
that is a piece of this that I think gets taken for granted. But
Okay.
yeah, so yeah, there was another thought that I had as you were saying that. Um, I I think what he's ultimately going for is that those principles, I think he would want to argue them, but he would want to say that that is not the most critical piece for success in a language classroom. Like
Okay.
that sense of plausibility
Mm,
and the openness and aliveness of the teacher and the student's environment in the classroom is
okay.
really where it thrives or
Okay.
doesn't thrive.
Mm,
So I think that's where he goes because well, let me go sequentially a little bit because there's kind of three sections to the rest of the article. One is that the idea of it all depends on the teaching context. Like, well, sure, there could be a best method for this context and another one for that context
yeah.
and things like that. And there's a certain level of appeal even to me about that, where, I'm teaching 5-year-olds. Well, you're gonna not do a lot that depends on reading, right?
Right.
Because they don't read any language yet.
Yeah.
So there's a level where there's some common sense to that. But one of one of the things here, oh yeah, it's more or less the point that too often that kind of statement, though, is just avoiding the issue of talking further about what are you doing in the classroom?
Okay.
What does that produce in the classroom?
Yeah.
And so he would argue that's counterproductive. We need to be able to talk about this, which reminds me of another thing I gained from being in graduate school. I find that in language teaching and teaching maybe in general, there's a lot of attachment of passion and even a sense of identity to the way that you teach and the sense that you have of who you are as a teacher, that you feel successful at it. And sometimes it means that, well, my students don't really gain proficiency, but they know 150 words every week. Or, like there's something that the teacher is attaching between the way that they're teaching and their sense of accomplishment or even self-purpose. And if we can kind of disentangle that a little bit and attach the sense of teacher identity and teacher value to something more like, I'm a teacher who grows and changes. I'm a teacher who keeps learning throughout my career. I'm a teacher who's tried many different types of approaches and activities. And, like I'm exploring and experimenting in my classroom with my students, along with them, side by side. I feel like that's going to give you a better sense of teacher identity that lets you explore new ideas, talk through things like the issue of methods and what is more productive for the goals you have, without feeling that sense of personal attack or personally attacking others. We can talk about these issues without it being personal, I would say. But very often I found myself as a language teacher in K to 12, and I hear teachers or see them respond in that way. When I got to graduate school, why I say it's graduate school that changed it was we had different perspectives as graduate students sitting there together in classes, and our goal was to explore ideas and to talk through them and to give evidence to them and to learn how to do research that would help us understand things better, so that our understanding was not perfect in any case, regardless of where we were coming from or why. And so it gave us the space to say, my job here is to question and to figure out more and to try new things. And I have this set of beliefs, I have this set of activities I like to do because of XYZ. And that's fine, but it's not I don't have to attack others, and I don't have to feel like if I let go of that, or I question it, or I re-examine it, that I'm going to lose my sense of self. So what I see then happen is like teachers can be sometimes offended by that kind of researcher mindset where they're questioning and like it feels jarring a little
You
bit.
feel like you're being questioned, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
like you yourself
Right.
are like, but but I
Yeah.
believe,
Yeah.
input is the
Yeah.
thing. And like, I hear you. I totally
Yeah.
get that. Let's
Hmm.
explore how. Let's
Yeah.
talk about details.
Right.
Hmm, is it always exactly the way you're thinking of it now, or could there be a more rich
Yeah.
understanding that might help you carry things out in a more nuanced way in your classroom? Or
Yeah.
are there factors in student proficiency that are going to affect the way in which they encounter
Yeah.
input in your classroom? Or, you
Yeah.
know, that
I
sort of
mean,
thing. So I
we,
appreciated that
yeah, yeah. We see
quite a
like
lot.
among teachers talking about this is sometimes our teachers say like, no, first you do this, then you do that, then you do that, like those exact steps. And even when you do that, there will still be teachers who interpret it a certain way. Like, oh, they said first do input. Okay. So first do input. For me, that means I will tell the students a story. Okay, that might be fine. Okay, well, I also tell students a story and it's, 20 minutes long. There was a teacher one time at a conference who this was a Star Talk conference about maybe 10 years ago. And I kept bumping into these Chinese teachers that had a new program. And one of them said, how's your program going? I said, oh, it's going really well. How's yours going? And he said, it's good, but we're trying to figure out how to help the kids. These are kindergartners. And we brought in a university lecturer to tell them about culture. And it was about an hour long. And the kids just didn't, it was difficult to understand why they wouldn't sit still for it. And I thought,
Wow, it
like,
was?
and I thought,
It was
well, you could call that input, if it was all in the target
kind of,
language and you're asking them to just sit there. So you can call one thing, you can call many things one thing.
yeah,
And I think teachers, when we talk, we assume too much about exactly
yeah,
how we do it and why we do it
exactly.
and how we're responsive, like what we're looking for and interacting.
Hmm.
Even if it's just telling a story, you're
Right,
doing it in a way that's tailored to your audience. You're watching their
right.
reactions
You're
and seeing if
literally
they're into
watching
it.
them in
Yeah.
real time.
There's a
Yeah,
kind of nonverbal interaction happening the whole time,
yep,
or verbal from one side at least.
yep.
But that none of that gets communicated when we say, oh, just step one, tell the students a story, or step
Hmm.
one, do input. There's
Hmm.
so much not communicated when we
Yeah,
talk about our practices in
yeah.
that ever, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And I see this also in people who will, teachers or independent language learners who will say, oh, I tried that input thing. It doesn't work. Like, okay, so what do you mean by you tried it?
What
What
did you
do you
do?
mean by input?
Right,
And what do you mean by doesn't work?
right, right, right.
And over what
Yeah,
time scale? What are we
right.
talking about? Like
Yeah.
it's a dismissal that's like I hear it because I'm married to a spouse in an alternative healthcare kind of a field. And people will sometimes tell him, oh, yeah, I tried that. And like,
Hmm. Yeah, tell me more. Yeah,
what do you mean by that? And
yeah,
so it's like, yeah, the sense that, oh, that new thing, I understood that entirely and I've set it all completely aside. I'm like, wait, that sounds really weird.
yeah,
Like, yeah, we have to be, and this kind of a perspective, I think, from the article is like allowing us some space to dig at that
yeah,
in a way that is professionally beneficial to all of us.
yeah,
Whether we're changing our mind or not, it's beneficial for us to explore and probe and think about these things and why we're doing what we're doing.
yeah.
So yeah, there's he has a list of possible questions about factors that you might need to take into account in contextual factors that could have a consequence in language teaching differences. But they're as he says, they can be far from clear. So things about age, about official language policies you have to do versus learners' actual goals or maybe teachers' actual goals or so if you have to end up with a big exam, for example, if you teach at an IB school or
Yeah.
an AP school,
Hmm.
maybe that wouldn't have been the way that you would cap off your program, but now you have to.
Yep.
And so there's, you're kind of combining a sense of like, I have to do that institutional goal
Yeah.
and my own personal teaching philosophy. So
Hmm.
yeah, so he concludes then like we don't need to just identify these different varieties. but we need some way of determining which kind of variety matters to instruction and how, and which doesn't. So if we're just saying context matters and dismissing it with that's not helpful
Yeah,
either.
yeah. The
So
context should be the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, one of the other things I like about this section is he talks about needs analysis, which I think is more known at a university level. It's the idea that well, you know it better. You tell him.
So needs
You've done
analysis
more with
is
it.
part of task-based language teaching, which is a whole research-based program. I don't know if program is the right word, but it's a very
Approach, maybe?
developed. What's that?
Approach, maybe?
Approach, but it's also very developed in terms of steps. Like first,
Mm,
what I've heard task-based language teaching people say is if you didn't start with a needs analysis in which you so I participated in one at University of Hawaii for the Chinese program. So I was interviewed by the professors, and they said, "What do you think your students need?" And they interviewed all the teachers, and they took lots of notes. And they interviewed a bunch of students. There was like a
mhm.
handful of like ten different students from different levels. What do you think you need this language for? They interviewed faculty. They interviewed as many different people as possible. I think if families can be involved, then they would interview them too. I don't think they did for this one. And for university, maybe families aren't usually as involved. So then you take your notes, you synthesize some sort of presentation for each of the groups, and you bring them back. This is how we did it. I don't know if this part's official, but then you present to them, hey, here are the patterns in needs that people came up with. Do you all agree or disagree with that? So it's a second round of identifying needs, and people can debate and disagree and say, oh no, I think you meant this. I think, oh, what about this? What about that? So then you modify it, and then you can devise like a survey from that, and you can have each person fill out the survey where they rank which goals they think are most important. And then, so those are three rounds. You could also just start with something less formal. I think J.D. Brown, who is into this, talked about doing foreign service consulting, and so he'd go to other countries and just sit with people and say, like at a job site, what are jobs you need at this job site? Like, what tasks do you have to do here? And so once you have your list of needs for the language, according to as many people as possible, and as being as thorough as your budget, time allows, and your interests allow, then you make your syllabus based on that. And so then your
Mhm.
syllabus is some sequence of tasks that are based on reality, based on the realities
Right.
of the students and the stakeholders themselves. The shortcoming I find, and they came to the same conclusion at the University of Hawaii one, is that people said things like, "Oh, I'd like to be able to watch movies sometime in the future. Maybe I'd like to talk to my grandma. Maybe sometime I want to travel." I've said this before. These are far from the kinds of needs that you see in a second language context, such as anybody coming to the United States
Yeah.
and needing English. They'll tell you,
Today.
"Yeah,
Yeah.
I need it now. Like
Yeah.
these are a lot of things I have to do now." And we don't see those kinds of needs. I talked to a friend in the Spanish department at UH, and I think they were doing a needs analysis. No, they didn't do a needs analysis. She was just teaching Spanish. And she said, yeah, the problem is that I want to do task-based language teaching. She was super into it. She was all bought in, but she was saying it's hard to do it when you can't identify any needs for the student in Spanish in
Yeah.
Hawaii. Like we really
Yeah.
don't have. If you're in California, you can probably identify some local restaurants, or there's something you could
Hmm.
do. It's I don't. I still it's still hard to call it a need, but at least it's a
Uh-huh.
place of usage.
Yeah.
It's a place of possible usage. We have Chinatown in Hawaii, so I'll tell my students, if you go down there. When I took a group down there, they all said they'd never been before, and so
Wow.
how
Yeah.
often do they go? How often will they go again? I don't know. Maybe never. So yeah, starting with needs analysis is very much when I hear needs analysis, I think, oh, okay, you want to make a task-based syllabus. That's what
Mm.
that's usually part of.
Yeah. Well, and he gets critical of that approach too, because what he says is that the instructional procedures most directly derivable from a specification of needs, wants, and objectives are those of supplying the learners with relevant tokens of language. In other words, vocabulary and grammar, like
Hmm.
I added that
Hmm.
last little bit there, but I'm
Sure.
mostly reading, or getting them to rehearse target language behavior in simulated target situations. So it's like what he's saying is like if you're identifying some sort of need, then what is most natural as a result of that is a grammar and vocabulary sequence and present, practice, produce. That kind of method where you're just like, make them rehearse doing that thing you think they need to be able to do. And he's critical of that type of
Yeah.
teaching. I mean, he's
Yeah.
like, it needs to be something more than this. But
Yeah.
so like, there has to be something beyond either
Yeah.
the needs of the student and the
Yeah.
context-based factors in making this really happen well. So,
Let me jump in real quick.
mhm.
That part about there needs to be something more than this. Yeah, language teachers will often default to, okay, what do you want me to do? Okay, I'm going to turn that into words and grammar. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, we're gonna watch a film clip. Let me turn that into words and grammar. Oh, okay, you need to be ready to ask the bus driver in your actual neighborhood where you want to go. Okay, let me turn that into words and grammar. Like
Hmm.
the something more than that can literally be, I guess they just call it focus on meaning, where you let the context lead you and to me, there's a certain kind of like leap of trust where I'm like, I trust that the context is going to require, or at least push, some kind of words and sentences or phrases to allow this context to become what it is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then let's
To
get
make the
into it.
context even happen.
Yeah, and then I will think of the simplest language or the most appropriate language or the most recyclable language. Like I'll lean
Mhm.
into words they already know
Yeah.
or words that sometimes are peculiar for that specific context, or phrases that are peculiar for that. Maybe they already know the words, but they're like, "What did you say?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's
Use.
get on with it." What is get on with it? Oh, get on with it is just I'm feeling rushed right now. Okay. Depending on the student's proficiency level, I'm going to make decisions about how simple or advanced to make my language, but I'm trusting that the context will require us to talk and that we will decide the words when we get there. And then it's important that we're not saying, "Oh, they already know those words." They haven't heard those words in that context. I'm sharing a room with a Spanish teacher right now, and I love it because she's going as immersive as she can. So I'm hearing a lot of Spanish, and it's just
Oh.
great for me to just be a little. I'm not a parasite, but I am.
You're a
I'm
fly on the
benefiting.
wall.
Fly
How's
on the wall.
that?
There you go. I'm not
Mhm.
hurting anyone.
Yeah.
It's my room too. But I love it. But then there's just little things where I think, oh, you can say como as a response there. Like there's
Mm.
just little, I already knew those
Yeah.
words. I just hadn't heard them in that little interactional context. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have
Yeah.
known.
You're
I wouldn't have
gaining.
thought. So I am learning. And so that to me is the value of like, if you're, whatever you're doing, making up stories, telling stories, reenacting needs-based, getting on the bus, ordering in a restaurant, simulation stuff, whatever it is, that's something more than words and grammar. It's really just like letting the context guide. What do you need to say next? Yeah.
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 I'm a
Yeah.
little radical. Okay.
Oh, no, I like it where there's freedom and flexibility to do that, where somebody's not telling you this is the unit you have to be on, this is the words and grammar you have
Yeah.
to make sure they know.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's,
Yeah.
I think, the way to go.
Yeah.
The thing that where he goes with it is then, if the needs analysis isn't pushing us into behaviors in the classroom that are going to be really helpful, he says, like here, and this is on page 165 of the article. So, any concept of developing in learners a more basic capacity for generating tokens of language when needed, in other words, proficiency, can they produce these phrases and words when they need them at the right times,
Sure.
um, or for adapting to unforeseen target language behavior as necessary, leads one towards ideas about the nature of language ability and the process of language acquisition, complex methodological issues that the discovery procedure in a needs analysis seeks to avoid.
Right.
So it's like it's
Yeah.
not even trying to figure out, well, how do people gain language? How do
Oh, yeah.
you know?
No, yeah.
It's just about
It's
like
just what do
what,
you need out there? Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Which,
So
yeah, to me sounds okay for job training. I feel like it's always best for job training.
yeah, and on occasion when you're like in a crunch need where you need to be able to produce language to survive in a setting,
Yep.
I get it. I
Here's your
get it.
memorized
Like
phrase that you need for this phone call operator job you have, or here's a memorized phrase you
exactly.
need for this thing. Yep. Yep.
But it's not the way to get a whole language.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yep.
not, yeah. So Right. So then he goes on to suggest that eclecticism, the idea that there is the possibility of then, if we're going to say no one method works, no one context determines it all, then now what if we just kind of pick and choose and call it, that he calls this section, there is some truth to every method. And so the idea is like, well, if you do a little of this and a little of that and a little of that and a little of that, you're sure to somehow catch it. And there was a quote that I marked about this section that I'm going to find before I misstate it. Okay, yes, here we go. Yeah, the idea that whatever is true about them, and I would say he's saying true towards that goal of that spontaneous ability with language. Whatever's true about them. This is presuming that whatever's true about them will be captured in the blending, and then the eclectic blend doesn't constitute a method, but instead an act of gambling or a hedging of bets.
Okay.
Like the idea, like I want to teach some explicit grammar because what if that helps?
Yeah.
Kind of a thing.
Sure.
And so he's critical of that. This indiscriminate blending of methods, he says, adds nothing to our pedagogic understanding since it offers no perception about what may be true about which method. You might blend and get all the bad parts,
Sure, sure.
And so he's saying like this could be at best truth by accident. So just an indiscriminate kind of, well, I'm going to do a little of everything just to make sure I'm covering my bases is not.
I see.
Not advisable. And so he comes to the conclusion then at the end there that we need to rethink what best might even mean.
Yeah.
And so often it's thought to be best results in terms of learning outcomes. Then there's a procedure, an experimental design or quasi-experimental design. But as he points out, that kind of experimental design deliberately removes you from the context in which language is actually happening in a classroom setting.
He's talking about like in a laboratory?
Oh yeah. Like if you're testing the results of something, you are by default controlling for factors that in a real classroom where you're using it, you cannot possibly control for.
Yeah.
That where students begin, where they end, exactly the time length spent on each step in a sequence or something like that. So he refers to Brumfit 1984 because teaching methods are essentially concerned with human interaction. How usefully can they be subjected to the processes of objective testing and prediction?
Sure.
And so there's some critique of like there's a kind of a limit to what we can know about exactly how, because if you're going to say, well, this does this thing.
Yeah.
You can't control for that in any other setting. Like it says, it's by removing and controlling for contextual features, this is page 169, you will have only the effect of disembodying the method of its actual operational form.
Yeah.
And so you've removed it from any ability to say in any one specific context, it will do XYZ thing.
Yeah, you're also you're only defining it also in terms of its predictive validity that we call it in testing, which means like, what is it helping them to do after? And that is typically what stakeholders care about. Okay, they were in your classroom. I don't know what you did in your classroom, but as a result of your classroom, let's go see what abilities they have. And we want to make sure that whatever methods you're doing, we don't care about that, whatever it is, that it results in them afterwards being able to do whatever. And I think that is that's an important voice. However, not all teaching methods are just about what happens after. There's also like, how do we be the most engaging? How do we track and follow development during the class? How do we respond to students in a way that is appropriate for their level at each moment? And those are parts of what I guess we'll call methods.
Yeah. I think what you just said overlaps with where he goes with it too. Because then he gets in that final kind of point that he's getting to. It's, the more you perceive language as being an implicit ability, something that's developed not directly, but maybe even sometimes in spite of the teaching, that you are ultimately, you're wanting to develop the teacher's subjective sense of perception that what I'm doing here is alive. He even uses the terms like that, real, that it's more than just a pedagogical ritual, as he
Yeah.
says on page 171.
Mm.
This idea that what keeps a teacher alive and growing is this sense of plausibility that they have, that they and
This is
does he?
working. He's like, this
Yeah.
is working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I believe in this thing. I see this is producing results that I like. Now, is it easy going to total relativism then? Like where it's just like, whoa, whatever you think is, I don't think he
No, I don't
does
think
that.
so. No.
Um, he's saying there's something more to it. But so let's see if I can
It sounds like
find.
some kind of fine tuning based on perception of your environment, your students in front of you. Um,
Mhm.
and then, but also
And
in a sense of yeah, how language development needs to work. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And the ability to talk with other teachers about those things openly and bump into each other. And then, like he says, the
Mm.
role of an expert is to present a very well-developed sense of plausibility, which he gets back to saying is more or less a method in
Yeah.
the kind of theory, principles,
Sure.
guidelines, and that by interacting between teachers and the expert, that's developing everyone's sense of plausibility, their sense of aliveness in the classroom, and their
Yeah.
sense of this not just being a rote thing to go through like
Yeah.
a robot or a
Yeah.
machine,
Yeah.
but it's developing teacher-learner rapport that is integral to classroom activity and more productive of learning. So his goal is that, the ideal is more worth our while to pursue than the notion of an objectively best method. So
Hmm. Hmm.
that sense of plausibility, that sense of being able to feel a a drive, I think,
Yeah.
in what you're doing in the classroom is more critical than an objective sense of
Do
this is
these
the best
steps
method
or
or
do
why.
these steps. Yeah. Everyone should do these steps. Yeah.
Right.
Cool.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me see if
Well,
there's any last thoughts on
sure.
there. And I see we're almost out of time too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a final thought here in his
Mhm.
conclusion on page 175. It's misconstruing the nature of teaching, if we're teaching or treating it as a set of procedures,
Right.
that it
Yeah.
needs to be something more real. He's avoiding mechanical teaching.
Yeah.
Here's one. The enemy of good teaching is not a bad method, but over routinization.
Sure. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I get it. Yeah, he's just saying that as teachers, you and I have been going to conferences and workshops and all kinds of professional development opportunities for a decade or more, and we've seen plenty of this. The teachers say, "No, let me tell you my exact steps. Like this is the way. This is the one way. Let
Hmm.
me tell you my exact steps." And you and I have even talked about ideal steps, but in terms of more general principles,
Hmm.
that very generally students are going to need some sort of exposure to the language. Now, a teacher might say, "Oh, well, I want them to be even more attentive, and so I'll show them something that's not language first." And so then I would say, "Oh, okay, that's fine too." It's like,
That's a principle you've got.
okay,
Okay.
you've got that, and that
Yeah.
it
Get their
sounds
attention.
well
Okay, that's a
argued.
good
It sounds
principle.
well argued.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit my exact steps or principles to follow. And so
Yeah.
if we're going to call that a method, then I would say, okay, that person's not following my method, but they've argued well. They've convinced me of why they would do a different step there, and so I would say that that's fine too. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, this has been enlightening, illuminating.
Good. Yeah. And of course, I'll link to that. We'll link to something about needs analysis and to other things. So,
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dan.
yeah, thank you.